Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Association of the United States Army's annual conference and trade show in Washington, D.C., the #1 gathering of U.S. Army leaders from around the world to talk about the service's strategy, its future, budgets, technology, and more. Our coverage here is sponsored by Bell, a Textron Company, Elbit Systems of America, L3 Technologies, Leonardo DRS, and Safran. And we're here at the Army acquisition enclosure here for the Pete and Dave show to talk a little bit about Army networks. Obviously one of the most important things if you're going to do multi-domain battle. Major General Peter Gallagher is with the New Futures Command. You're the director of the Crossfunctional Team for Networks. And my friend Dave Bassett, Major General, who is the Program Executive Officer for C3 Networks, C3T, okay. I just missed it by that much.
CFT, C3T.
Exactly. Boy, you know, I'm glad that we're not drowning in acronyms here. So, General, let me start with you. With the Futures Command, you're basically the requirements engine for the networks that we need. You know, there's nothing more fundamentally important, especially as you're going into a great power competition, to be able to build these networks that are resilient, that are going to be contested in the electromagnetic space, in cyberspace, and actually in space, as we heard. We were over at Air Force Association, a lot of talk about that. Talk to us a little bit about, as you're building the requirements with your small, your elite, your combat seasoned team, what are the kind of networks and systems the Army needs for the future if it's going to be the key land component for this multi-domain battle space?
Well, our networks, obviously, they have to be able to work. They have to be simple enough for soldiers to be able to install, operate, and maintain in a very violent, very lethal fight. And not add complexity to the decision-making process. So from our young soldiers out there, our maneuver soldiers, in a variety of formations, they need to be able to put these systems into operation with ease. Our signal planners and signal leaders need to have a network that works for them. They shouldn't have to work so difficult and so hard for the network itself. And it's, the most important thing is the network's got to be able to operate and work in a contested environment. You alluded to that we're going to be contested. We're going to be contested in spectrum, we're going to be contested in space, and our network, we have to have multiple options that give our leaders and our soldiers the ability to connect wherever they find themselves on the battlefield. And they should not have to do major reconfiguration for that to happen. So we're going to leverage what industry can bring to bear, what our research and development engineering counterparts can bring to bear in the science and technology community to leverage evolving technology to address those threats.
And both of you, I should say, are at Aberdeen Proving Ground, sitting right next to each other, right, so that the high concept also meets the deliverable in terms of what the acquisition art of the possible is. General Bassett, talk to us a little bit about your efforts in trying to get your arms around the problem. You have a reputation of being somebody who's, you know, an expert acquisition officer, one of the best in the Army, and being able to deliver these kind of capabilities and do it, you know, very, very quickly. Talk to us a little bit about how you're translating this kind of the guidance and the desire from the operator to do that into usable capability and do it quickly and efficiently.
I think one of the big keys that I've found so far, and I think one of the real values of having the cross-functional team in place, is a willingness to recognize that we're not going to get it right the first time, but we can do experimentation, we can drive requirements by the art of the technically possible while we're informed by the threat. And so we got a real running start on this. I mean, by the time I joined the team last February, General Gallagher and PO Soldier and a number of folks from POC3T were already iterating on some changes to the Army's tactical network, fielding additional kit that we've immediately been able to put into employment into Afghanistan, giving soldiers a significantly better capability that begins to address many of the characteristics that Pete just talked about. And so this willingness to kind of take on a little bit of uncertainty, to move quickly with what industry can deliver, and to make and field a new Army network over time. And I think already we're in a really great place. We've got new Army radios, both a Manpack and a leader radio, that are in production today. We've got new mission command systems, some of which are just kind of off to our right, that we're going to be demonstrating at the next NIE here coming up next month. So new mission command, new radios. We're working on making that network operations, the way you manage the network itself, considerably simpler, working hand in hand with the CFT on those priorities, and then figuring out how we can evolve that capability over time, knowing we won't get the requirement perfect right up front, but rather having a requirement that can evolve and grow with us as we go.
One of the big things we've learned from industry over the last few months is we've really been taking a good hard look at the problems with our network and what's in the art of the possible for how we're going to improve our network, is this concept of what's called a DevOps model. Getting the developers and the operators side by side, learning and iterating, and as General Bassett said, getting that feedback from soldiers and leaders on the ground and being able to iterate and improve as you go. Get feedback, make adjustments, continue to improve, whether it's an insertion to a software-defined radio, an augmentation to a ergonomics requirement, that if something doesn't have the right feel, the soldiers provide the input, and General Bassett and his team will work with the vendors to fix it. And we're learning a lot already, and we anticipate with the support of Forces Command and the Army Service Component Commands, they're providing us soldiers and units that are going to give us that feedback. And it's pretty powerful when you've got a willing commander on the ground that's going to provide soldiers with that kind of feedback.
Let me take so you can give our viewers an update. Right, Jitters, the radio was supposed to be the single waveform, the single radio that was going to cure all of our ills, and unfortunately, after billions of dollars, not so much. What's the way ahead now? Bring us up to speed for some of the folks who haven't been paying as close attention to this and just are still programmed to think, hey, what's the state of the Army communication enterprise, in the aftermath of that program?
Yeah, one of the big pitfalls that we can fall into is going after technology that's just not there yet. And I think software-defined radios were one of those technologies that when it was mandated, it wasn't quite there yet. And the waveforms weren't that mature. I mean, these radios and those waveforms go all the way back to the early design of the FCS network. And we were still dealing with the same waveforms and the same radios until just very recently. So this kind of technology has finally matured. Software-defined radios are beginning to deliver on the promise that we had. It doesn't mean that you don't have to make any changes ever, but you do have enough flexibility now so that the waveforms that we're now moving to, in some cases we can port them onto radios that we bought 8 years ago. Right. And so we're leveraging commercial waveforms that were previously unavailable to us, recognizing that some of the government developed waveforms just weren't going to get us there. And so a lot more flexibility, but the hardware itself is 2 or 3 generations better than what we saw in JTRS. And I think that's a technology really whose time has come. It's actually really hard right now to buy anything other than a software-defined radio in this space, because if you do buy a hardware-defined radio, you're going to bake in either the vulnerabilities you haven't discovered yet or some limitations. And in this case, we think we've got the right set of radios to carry us into the future and really start to deliver on the promise that was JTRS.
I think the thing I would like to add is the radio technology that has evolved into where we are today, it gives us multiple options. So you can use a variety of waveforms, a variety of areas within the spectrum, and spectrum will be contested. So these radios operate, from anywhere from low band VHF to, in many cases, satellite connectivity, and so we're providing soldiers and leaders with multiple options. And so I think the multi-band and the ability for some of these, multi-channel radios to do cross-banding, it gives our soldiers and our formations better options going forward.
That was one of the big changes, by the way, was we went from a single channel data radio now to a 2-channel leader radio, so that if you are contested in one channel, you can move over to a different waveform. And it's about options. I mean, you're never going to have a network that the adversary can't jam if they get close enough, but you can have the options to fall over to other things that are more difficult to jam, more difficult to detect, or alternative communications means, and that's really, I think, been the result of the partnership here with the CFT.
You forget about SYNCARS, but SYNCARS is the backbone radio of the United States Army. So for a second I was thinking, like, why is Dave talking? Oh yeah, that's right, SYNCARS.
Yeah. SYNCARS is a waveform now, not a radio.
That's true, actually, right?
And so we're not going to get rid of a couple of 100,000 SYNCARS radios overnight. And we have, as we evolve, we got to make sure all this stuff works together.
And so the radios we're fielding they can communicate with SYNCARS radios, but next generation, what's in the art of the possible going forward? As technology emerges, as algorithms are developed by industry that solve problems, complex problems, and help us fight our way through a contested environment, we want to make sure that we have the hardware that will support a software upgrade, and that's what we're trying to move towards.
Let me ask you, from the requirements shaping process, right? Almost everybody who's looked at the acquisition system has said, hey, you know what, once upon a time it was a handful of really smart guys in the Army, whether they were tankers, whether they were redlegs, whether they were signalmen, and they'd get together and they'd be like, look, here's what we need, and let's build what we need based on the intelligence that we have and our expertise as operators. How are you distilling purity in this and not gold plating requirements or getting to the point where it's unobtainium for the guy who's got to deliver it, who's like, oh my God, I mean, you know, there's no way for us to do that. What are some of the principles you're using with your team to make sure that you are disciplined in the process and not overreaching and keeping requirements simple? It was amazing how many people here were pointing to Hondo Gertz, the Navy acquisition executive, and the MQ-25 unmanned refueling aircraft the Navy just acquired. You had two requirements: carry gas, land on a carrier, and the rest of it was, you know, subject to discussion. And the Navy was going to be the integrator on it. In a lot, in this case, where the Army's going to be the integrator on it. How are you using that purity on what it is that you really need and what soldiers will need, not just now, but in 5, 10 years?
Yeah, so I think it starts with not getting too clever for ourselves in how we define the requirements and over-specifying the technical requirements. It's probably better for us to define the operational problem we're trying to solve. And let's figure out what the technical requirements are based on the state of technology today, the threat that we're trying to counter, and what is, you know, what's good enough to give us a significant advantage in our warfighting capability and not over-specify. As General Murray mentioned earlier in this, he talked about, you know, we specify a percentage of you know, with 3 decibel points of you know, clarity, so you spend millions trying to test to that level when better than what you have might be good enough to win the next fight. And so as technology will evolve, so will we want to make sure that our requirements evolve with it. So one of the big findings and a big problem with the network that came out a couple years ago is the requirements as written and the capabilities as delivered were not delivering the systems that met the operational needs of those soldiers, not only in a contested environment, but in the environment we're in. So we responded with, you know, joint urgent operational needs statements and buying other solutions off the shelf that may not have been fully tested, but they were better than what we had. And so we've got to work through not only an iterative requirements process. It's not all about agile acquisition. I think there's a lot of folks that concern themselves with, hey, we got to fix the acquisition process. We do, but that's part of a bigger institutional thing we got to fix, and it's how do we cycle requirements quicker and make them less specific and it gives the acquisition community and industry freedom of action to actually solve the problem we're trying to solve. But then how do we do iterative testing? Okay, testing can slow you down and bog you down, and we want to get, you know, what's the capability, what's the limitation, and allow commanders to make risk decisions based on that feedback. So there's an institutional change that's going to impact not only the acquisition community, the requirements community, the resourcing community, but we've got to get the testing community on board with this as well. And so we've got good partners at Army Test and Evaluation Command on our team, and you know, we're working through how do we test going forward, because it will be different. It's going to have to be different.
Kind of the simple way that I sometimes describe it is we used to approach requirements like we want to use requirements as a forcing function that drives the system to deliver a certain threshold of capability and prevents you from delivering anything that might be less than that. And we can be so specific that we've constrained ourselves from actually innovating. And so we're trying to shift to a model where requirements can become an enabling function to enable us to go be innovative and deliver better capabilities out over time. At the same time, the contracts that we have in place with our radios are built to incentivize that innovation. So the radios that we're buying today may not be the same radios we deliver in 5 years, because we can incentivize the vendors on that contract to add innovative capability over time within the contracts we already have in place without having to go through a lengthy recompete. But if we do see technology that we need to get to a vendor outside of the radio vendors we have, we can on-ramp new vendors onto both of those contracts. So I think we've got some innovation going on in the contracting and procurement side, along with a new mindset on how we approach requirements.
Let me ask you the leading question that's being discussed here, which is, you know, it's awesome to have great combat seasoned operators that are the ones who are setting the requirements, but there's a concern about a disconnect that the Futures Command is causing with the acquisition community. We've heard this from executives across the floor. Secretary Esper said, look, we're working this process, but I can assure you that there's not going to be a disconnect in the way that we're trying to do this. You two are an excellent example of how there's not a disconnect. So talk to us about the relationship you two have and how you address, I'm sure that there are some people who must have been asking you that question over the course of the the last couple of days anyway. You know, how have you been answering them?
Well, I will tell you that the network is required for every other modernization priority the Army's trying to focus on, right? So everything, you know, whether it's long-range precision fires, whether it's future vertical lift, next-generation combat vehicles, the soldier, you know, as a system, the soldier lethality, and our integrated air and missile defense, all of those modernization priorities require the underpinnings of a network. So it's that ubiquitous nature of the network and the requirements of the network requires a collective team of teams approach anyway. So I know that, first of all, my team is very small, and I have to rely on the expertise that General Bassett and his team bring to the table. They are the acquisition professionals. He's got 30 years of acquisition experience, coupled with my 30 years of operational experience, and we're getting feedback like from, you know, with other folks that are on my team that bring experience from a variety of backgrounds. That's powerful if we harness it and focus it on what we're really all about, and that's delivering outcomes. And those outcomes are about making our soldiers and our formations out there more lethal in the fight. And that's what Dave and I are absolutely both committed towards, and he's been he came on board. We started the CFT back in November of last year, so about 11 months. Dave came on board in February, right? And I mean, he hit the ground running. He came out of the combat vehicles, and with a lot of institutional knowledge. But he's a former signal officer, so you know he understands networks. He's a great teammate, and his team is part of my team. I mean, you know, as I said, you know, his lead engineer was working with my team every day. Is basically by default he's my lead engineer as well. And so it's been tremendous. And I know. Again, I can't do it alone. I don't have the depth and breadth of talent, and I'm relying on partners like Dave and his team to help us make it happen.
We heard the message from Army leadership, which is we're going to modernize through CFTs and the Futures Command. And I'm a guy that likes to deliver capability. I said we're gonna hang together or we'll hang separately. And so this is about, if this is how the Army's going to modernize, and I think we've seen great synergy there, then we're all in, and we're going to commit to working together. And I think where there's a partnership and where we recognize the skills and the strengths of each part of the team, we've been able to capitalize on both. I have not spent the last 30 years fighting the Army network. I had a few good years as a signal officer, and I've been doing acquisition ever since. But I have learned about contracting and logistics and engineering and all skills that the average signal officer doesn't spend a lot of time developing. And so I think this is about leveraging the skill sets of both to deliver the capability we both recognize the Army needs.
I've got two more questions because we're about to get the hook and you guys are very busy. First is multi-domain battle. So this is the Army network piece that's going to have to interact with each one of the other military services. We've heard the same thing from Dave Goldfein, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Bob Neller, the Marine Corps Commandant Senate, and so has John Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations. How are you working what you're doing to ensure that it seamlessly interacts with what the other services are doing, given that you're going to call for fires from ships that are going to be offshore or submarines, there will be airstrikes that are going to come from land-based aircraft, there are going to be stealth aircraft that are going to be involved in that mix, which are going to have different kind of communications demands and requirements, and that in a contested environment where you're going to have to shift at mission command. And so I have a kind of a tactical question for you as well in terms of, you know, this can't be only a technological solution, but talk to us about how you're thinking from a requirement standpoint, and Dave, how you're acting from an acquisition standpoint to dovetail and mesh this with what the other services are doing.
Yeah, so one of the things as we assessed the Army, the shortfalls with the Army networks, and identified what are those baseline requirements and characteristics going forward that the network must deliver. Joint interoperability has to be baked in on the front of anything we deliver. The joint warfighting capability, everything we do as an Army, we're going to be fighting with joint partners. That's why we're leveraging solutions that are available today from the joint and special operations partners, and we're adapting and buying those capabilities and providing that to our soldiers and getting that in those systems in our formations. The coalition accessibility is critical as well. You know, we're not maybe going to be completely interoperable with every coalition partner, but we have coalition partners that are shoulder to shoulder with us on a multitude of battlefields already, and we know going forward we're going to fight as a coalition. So coalition accessibility is also critical. So having common standards and sharing those standards with our teammates and making sure that the Army's not out rolling its own, but we are actually working with partners. I interface with the Special Ops, and I've got a Marine Corps liaison that participates with our team. Much of what General Bassett and his team do in the acquisition community and in network design and the fundamentals going forward, they bring in the Marine Corps and Air Force and other joint partners. So it's got to be baked into everything we do.
Yeah, from a mission command standpoint, what I don't want to do is to have to bring in separate servers, separate capabilities for every domain, right? So as we add cyber situation awareness, for example, into our mission command systems, I want it built on our common mission command framework. And so over the last 6 months, we've been able to publish what that framework is, and we've basically said to industry, look, this is kind of the rules that you're going to have to play by to deliver capability within our mission command design. You can tell us you don't like the pieces we've selected, and you can maybe ask us to replace things with your code, but what we don't want is another stovepipe for every new mission command system that we deliver across the joint force. And so I think we're making a lot of great steps in that direction so that as we add domains, multi-domain, we're going to keep adding domains, we want it to be a unified mission command system.
Operating in a contested environment involves a lot of mission command. It's not only technology-based. General Mercier, the former Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, used to talk about this, that we've got to get into this new future where connectivity, his big initiative was the combat cloud, to have a secure cloud network upon which the data resides so that actually you're not carrying it on board, it exists, and if each one of these nodes is interfered with, ultimately you can still manage to communicate, share information. I want to get a sense more broadly from you two, what part of this is a doctrinal, intellectual process, and what part of it is a technological solution when you're in a contested battle space? When you guys started your career, they were still practicing MCON, emissions control, where you guys were supposed to execute complex objectives without a lot of radio chatter. Right. Each one of the military services used to be able to do it, but now we have generations of people who have just gotten so used to the power of a smartphone in their pocket that the notion of communicating without it becomes sort of very, very difficult. So talk to us about the human element of it. Talk to us about whether combat cloud is something that can serve a medium as a connecting function, including with our allies, and how much of it is just sort of the discipline, intellectual process change.
I think every bit of what you laid out is something we need to explore and assess as we go forward. So if you just start at kind of found after 16 years of war, the heavy demand for full motion video and the decision-making process, and when you're operating in a counterinsurgency and a counter-terrorist environment where you're based out of forward operating bases and combat outposts, and you go in, you do a mission based on intelligence, and you have the access to the full motion video feeds and everything at your disposal, that may not be available on every echelon in a very mobile, very lethal, very violent fight where the enemy gets a vote and you're fighting through a contested battle space in spectrum or space or anything else. So we have to understand what are those information exchange requirements on echelon. What's the minimum information exchange requirements on echelon from the squad all the way back to the corps or the joint task force, and how do we ensure that the network can deliver that? And at the pointy edge of the pointy tip of the spear where the rubber meets the road, where that soldier is out there on the ground, we owe the soldiers and the leaders multiple options. So it's the ability to fight through contested spectrum and the bigger, broader, from command post to command post, we're in an internet protocol-based network. So cybersecurity is critical, right? So we got to ensure that our network is protected end to end. So endpoint security, identity management, all those things matter because we want to make sure that the data, wherever it's stored, whether it's in a forward-based server or in a cloud, the transport's got to be able to reach that cloud, and the soldier has to understand that the data he's looking at or that leader is the integrity of that data is true, okay? And that's the thing we got to work our way through. I think cloud can enable that, but we got to ensure what that really means, especially on echelon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes sir, it does.
Yeah, I mean cloud is obviously an interesting concept, and it works really well where you have ubiquitous connectivity. In the absence of that connectivity, you've got to do some edge processing. You've got to make sure that your systems operate in the absence of a connection. And so I think, so cloud is something that we need to evaluate. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where we have enough bandwidth that we can just sort of publish everything into a global cloud that we're always connected to. I think if you make those assumptions, you're going to not do very well when you're disconnected. But there's going to be some things that we do want to put into the cloud as the bandwidth is available so that we can leverage it for analytics and other things that'll help us fight better, particularly as we analyze data that's available to the force. And so I think we got to go down that path of saying what's the most information, the most important information, what's going to give us the most warfighting capability as we can make it available to some kind of central processing. But I think this idea of a sort of a global cloud is maybe a bit too far off.
Major General Dave Bassett, who is the PEO C3T.
Tactical.
and Major General Pete Gallagher, who is with Futures Command, the director of the Network Cross-Functional Team, both at sunny Aberdeen Proving Ground. Sir, thanks very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. It's always great seeing you, Dave. All the best to both of you. Thanks very much, and look forward to coming up and visiting with you guys.
Thanks, sir.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vago. Appreciate it.